So it's very interesting that your book is titled Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Can you speak more about that? How did Washington start the new Cold War with Russia and this catastrophe in Ukraine?
Sure. Well, the book is divided by presidents. Those are the chapters. I start with H.W. Bush and the end of the last Cold War. And I show in the book that, and based on a lot of original documents and that kind of thing, there's a lot of secondhand sources in there. I have more than uh, 7,000 citations or 7,000 footnotes, almost 8,000 citations or something like that. It's all at scotthorton.org/provoked/notes. If people want to go look at that, it's about 400 pages of footnotes for them, and including with all the hot links if you go look at the PDF file there. Um, but so I started with H.W. Bush, and the story essentially is that at the end of the Cold War, the Americans decided, led by the neoconservatives, but not exclusively them, the consensus essentially was that America must maintain dominance in Europe because it's either us or it's the Germans. And nobody wants the Germans to be dominant. Even the Soviets don't want the Germans to be dominant. They would prefer that we stay too, and that America and NATO remain the dominant power in Europe. And the Germans, pardon me, the Soviets allowed Russian, German reunification and removed their troops and allowed all this to go forward on the promise that America would not expand NATO further east. We'd keep Germany down, like in the deal, but not expand east from there. And I know that there are a lot of people who have claimed to debunk that. I guess there's a new study that came out supposedly recently that claimed to debunk it. Well, it's nonsense. I completely rebunked it in the book. I show in no uncertain terms that they promised over and over and over again, including on the famous meeting of February 9th, 1990, James Baker made this promise to Gorbachev 6 different times. And then when the German foreign minister said the same thing, and even more explicitly, of course, this means we could never go to Poland or the Baltics or Hungary, then Baker sat right there while he said that at a press conference and essentially nodded in agreement. We know that Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of Germany, this was the basis upon which he made the handshake deal with Gorbachev. That you heard what Baker said. We promised not to expand NATO 1 inch to the east. And based on that handshake, Gorbachev told Kohl, okay, you can go ahead and reunite. So it was not just a promise, it was a deal. It was an agreement that the West made. And of course, the German foreign minister has every right to make that promise just as much as James Baker does. And then the same thing goes for, again, the German chancellor, as well as Margaret Thatcher and her successor, John Major, and their foreign minister, Douglas Hurd, and all the rest. And I show in the book over and over and over again. And it wasn't just on, and Robert Gates as well. It was not just that day, it was the whole spring long. This was the basis of all these agreements. And the loophole is that they say that, well, no, they weren't even talking about that. They were only talking about expanding NATO within Germany. And that's sort of kind of true. That's the kernel of truth that they're debunking, but it's nothing really. And that is that Baker's original promise actually didn't really make much sense. He was, in a sense, saying, we will bring East Germany, we will reunite the two Germanys, but only the Western half of it will be in NATO. And we won't expand NATO inside Germany. But what are we even talking about here? If we're talking about the war guarantee, then that doesn't make any sense, right? It's not like the East German regime is going to be in charge now. We're reuniting under West German leadership is the new government right here. The Soviets lost, the commies are gone. And so that doesn't make sense. So then they revised it and they said, well, what we really meant was, here's what we'll do. Yes, all of Germany obviously will be in NATO, but we promise not to move our troops or nuclear weapons into the former GDR, the former East Germany. And we'll do it that way. And so that was how they resolved that dilemma. The Hawks like to pretend that that was the only thing that was ever at issue. But of course, that's completely preposterous. And as I show in the book, and anyone can read all this at the George Washington University National Security Archive, they have posted under the headings, what Gorbachev heard, and then later what Yeltsin heard of all the promises that were made to them about how this was going to go. And then I show it myself, but also I cite the great scholar Joshua Shifrinson, showing that the key to understanding what was going on here is that the Americans were lying to the Soviets and then later the Russians to get them to acquiesce and get out of our way so that we could get what we wanted. If we don't have to always push them down, we can just lie to them and get them to acquiesce. That's easier. And so they did that. And what they said was, it doesn't even matter. NATO expansion is moot anyway, because NATO is not even going to be a military alliance anymore. NATO is going to be a political organization. Think something like the EU plus America, a political and economic thing. And we're going to replace NATO as a military alliance with the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE. And later under Bill Clinton, it was the same scam, but under the Partnership for Peace, the PFP. And what they were telling first Gorbachev and then Yeltsin was that, look, we don't need an alliance because there's no enemy anymore. So instead, we're going to have as a security partnership. And you, the Soviets, and later the Russians, and all of the Eastern European countries will all already be automatically members. They already were. Everybody had signed up to the CSCE after the Helsinki Accords in 1975. So Russia and Ukraine and the Baltics and Belarus and Hungary and Czechoslovakia at that time, they all were already members of the CSCE. So this way, essential, for example, Ukrainian neutrality and Eastern European neutrality was baked in. And so this is what they told the Russians to get them essentially to acquiesce. And they knew what they were doing all along was lying, and that they meant for NATO, of course, to be America's, tool of military dominance on the continent. And they always meant to expand it. And they always meant to use, in the Clinton years, the Partnership for Peace as simply a halfway house for NATO membership for future member states. When they couldn't bring everybody in on the first round, they put the guys who they wanted in the second round in the PFPE, and then that would be a step closer to NATO membership, when they came back for them in 2004. So that's essentially the deal. And Bill Clinton picked up the same policy from H.W. Bush, which is essentially the reverse of what they all claimed that they were doing. You guys, I'm sure, all learn the same lessons as me in government school here in America, right? Is that they never blame Woodrow Wilson for getting us into the war. They always skip the part about how the war was over. The war was a stalemate until Woodrow Wilson got us in. Then it was all his fault that he helped tip the balance so far in favor of the British and the French that they were able to exact these punishing terms on the Germans, which then helped lead to the rise of the Third Reich. And of course, the only reason they teach us this in school is so they can beat us over the head with the League of Nations Treaty and blame the right-wing isolationists in the Senate who wouldn't create the first United Nations, because then America would have been dominant in Europe and we would have invaded those Nazis earlier or something. And then that would have, that's the way they teach it. But part of that lesson, though, is the punishing treatment of Germany in the Treaty of Versailles and the resentment that caused in Germany, the complete destruction of their economy, the starvation blockade, the stripping of all their external territories and giving them away to other countries and all these things helped lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler. And, Daryl Cooper quoted Lady Astor someone asked at a dinner party, where was Hitler born? And she said, at Versailles. And they all went, oh, he. Yes, that's so right. Because we all understand that was what led to the rise of National Socialism. And of course, in reaction to the communists in the East, who also happened, the Russian Revolution was possible because Wilson bribed Kerensky, the original winner of the Russian Revolution, to stay in the war. And then the communists were able to take over on their fourth try, 8 months later. And so the Soviet Union was all Woodrow Wilson's fault too. And then the communists in the East were part of what drove people to support the Nazis in Germany as well. So anyway, that's why everything in the world is all Woodrow Wilson's fault. And because why? Because he empowered the Germans and the French to do what they did more than anything. And of course, the Russian thing too. But so then what do they say? What do they teach all of us in school, right? Is that we learn that lesson. We're way better at ruling the world than the Germans than the British and the French, because what we did was we befriended and rebuilt our enemies after World War II, the Germans and the Japanese. And now they're with us. And instead of conquering their territory and ruthlessly exploiting them and starving them and whatever, we rebuilt them and made them our friends. That's the American way. So everybody knows that, right? Like, it's cliche. That's how everyone is supposed to understand the history of the world wars and America's role in them, essentially, right? Except for the part about it being all Wilson's fault in the first place. But so then the Bush administration and the Clinton administration both invoked the lessons of Versailles. And so we have this great victory over the Soviet Union. Now we have to be very cautious and treat them with respect and be a good sport. I mean, Bush Sr. he was the captain of the baseball team, right? We got to be a good sport. He even said, look, I didn't go over there and tap dance on the Berlin Wall when they tore it down. I didn't rub it in their face. And it's a good thing he didn't too. If he had really been, openly exploitative as the Soviet Union was falling apart, it would have remained. It was able to be overthrown by the Russians in the end because the Americans were being essentially inconspicuous in the thing and letting them handle it, which is what happened. And Yeltsin ended up overthrowing the last of the Soviet regime after their failed coup of August of 91. So that attitude of friendship and, magnanimity was the proper thing to do. And they knew that. But the thing is this, we occupied Berlin and all, 2/3 of Germany. And we occupied Japan, and we had the Soviet Union to hang over their heads. Would you prefer to be occupied by Joe Stalin or by Harry Truman? And so they chose Truman, right? That makes a lot of sense. But we didn't occupy Moscow at the end of the Cold War. We didn't have a MacArthur viceroy to rule over Moscow and take control of their military and dismantle all the last of their nuclear weapons or anything like that, right? So were they really willing to heed the lessons of Versailles? Were they really willing to befriend and help to rebuild their vanquished foe when they knew they would not have control? The answer is no. The answer is we're going to essentially keep the Cold War going. We're going to be less explicit about our hatred of them. But because Russia is and will remain independent from us, even under drunken Boris Yeltsin, who was, greatly under American influence, but never truly under American control, they refused to do what they could to help. And this includes, I think, the shock therapy policy, which they said was trying to help them. But Jeffrey Sachs, who was part of the thing, he says that he believed that Washington had made a deliberate decision to hurt the Russians rather than help them, to keep them down, to beat them down. Now, you got to understand, transforming from full communism, where the government literally owned all industry, everything, to capitalism was going to be a massive shift and correction with all kinds of unintended and uncontrollable consequences all over the place. But they did the absolute worst hash of it that they possibly could have done, with the Americans over there helping them. USAID and the Harvard Institute for International Development went over there and just screwed them. Their voucher programs and their loans for shares and all of their gimmicks. They did everything but truly protect property rights and contracts and free markets and prices. It was all just they went from communism to the worst kind of just kleptocracy and corporatism. And there's no point in denying the American role in it all, because they bragged about it the whole time, that it was their idea and they knew what they were doing and this is how we're going to do it. And they just absolutely ruined it. And the only question is how much they were even really trying to help, or whether they were really trying to sabotage the new Russian Federation from the get-go. And then, of course, there's the Balkan Wars. And the primary purpose of the Balkan Wars was to permanently establish and ensconce American power as the dominant force in Europe. We'd been somewhat distracted with Iraq War I, and the Germans got out ahead of us on the Balkans, recognizing the independence of Slovenia and Croatia first. So then H.W. Bush had to rush in there and recognize the independence of Bosnia and kick that whole war off in order to say, we're the ones in charge here. We're the ones who get to decide what happens and all that. I demonstrate that clearly in the book. And then, of course, was NATO expansion. Now, most people, you might not believe me. It's worth checking into. 2/3 supermajority of the Council on Foreign Relations opposed NATO expansion. All of the wisest graybeards, including the Hawks from the old Cold War, were against it. And I mean Robert McNamara and Robert Nitze, of course, George Kennan, Nitze's rival, and including the sitting Secretary of Defense, William Perry, under Bill Clinton, tried to stop him. And it was, Dwight Eisenhower's granddaughter, Susan, put out a joint letter signed by 70 or 100 admirals and generals and former foreign service officers and ambassadors from all over the world saying, don't do this. All these academics at all the universities too. said we should not be doing this. What are we doing? We're rubbing our victory in their face. We're rubbing their nose and shit. We are going to cause a problem. We are going to get a reaction, a terrible, negative, nationalist reaction out of the Russians. They said this could kill the START II treaty. This could ruin everything that we worked for. And then they did it anyway. And they did it anyway because the Democrats wanted Polish votes and Lockheed dollars. And so, what every wise man with a gray beard sitting at his desk at the think tank knew was stupid and horrible and wrong was done anyway over these parochial, public interest, public choice theory type narrow parochial interests by politicians and their benefactors. And of course, Lockheed wanted to get rid of fighter jets. They don't care what's good for America over the long term. They're just in it for that. But that's a lot of money that, Lockheed is the biggest of them all. They cash checks for tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And then they recycle 0.0001% of that back into the think tanks, back into, their whatever groups like the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq and the Committee for NATO Expansion, all the thickest, most expensive steak dinners for all the senators in Washington cost them nothing but chump change of taxpayer money that they got for free in the first place. And so it's a huge part of the military industrial complex and their role in pushing this policy forward, despite the best advice of everybody who knew better. Now, two of the most prominent hawks were, of course, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Rockefellers' men, and they really wanted to pursue NATO expansion. But even they said from the very beginning, of course, well, maybe not from the very beginning, but they did say for years and years, of course, we will have to make a special exception for Ukraine because this is a country that was part of Russia and part of the Russian Empire for hundreds of years. They have all this shared culture. They have border regions that used to be part of Russia. And then the communists drew the borders where they drew it and all this. This is the touchiest subject of all. Millions of Russians are on the wrong side of the border here, quote unquote. And so they knew if we try to take Ukraine away and integrate them fully into the West, then that's going to cause a horrible major reaction from the Russians. And so they knew what they were doing and they did it anyway. And through 4 rounds of NATO expansion by 2008, W. Bush promised that he would bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO in the Bucharest Declaration. And they'd already done, by the way, the war in Serbia, they launched 3 weeks after they finally brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in the first round of NATO expansion. It's just a defensive alliance. What are you crying about? 3 weeks later, they launch an aggressive war based on lies, pretending 100,000 people had been killed and they had to go rescue the rest, which is a total hoax. They launched that war. And then under W. Bush, they brought 9 more countries in, including the Baltic states, right on the Russians' border and all that. And famously, and if you guys haven't read this, you should look into it. It's great. It's right there on wikileaks.org. It'll take you 5 minutes to read. It's a memo from William Burns, who later became Joe Biden's CIA director. It's called Niet Means Niet, and it's written in February of 2008. And it's Burns, who's then the ambassador to Moscow, writing to Condoleezza Rice and saying, you have to stop Bush from his planned invitation to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Georgia's one thing, and that's bad enough. But Ukraine is the most neuralgic issue, right? In other words, causes mental illness among these people when you bring it up to them. He said, is it the brightest of red lines? He said he's talked to, and this is, I'm mixing what he wrote in that memo and also what he wrote in an email to Rice that he quoted in his memoir later, that he's talked about this with everyone in Moscow of any importance whatsoever, from the most enlightened liberals to the most barbarian knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin. Everybody says they're willing to fight about this. No one is willing to allow Ukraine to join NATO. If you try to bring them in, he's paraphrasing Lavrov. The foreign minister of Russia tells me to tell you that if you do move to bring Ukraine into NATO, that could cause a civil war inside Ukraine. And then that would force Russia to have to choose whether to intervene, a decision they do not want to have to make. So in other words, this is as close as Sergei Lavrov gets to begging. Please, for the love of God, do not put us in this position. We are promising you, we will break this country before we let you take it. So just don't, okay? And then Burns tells Rice, hey, man, I read this guy loud and clear, and I advise you, Madam Secretary, that you should too. We should not do this. He later followed up with an email where after a paragraph or two of this, he says, if I don't have you convinced by now, you might as well just stop reading here. I just don't know what else to say to you. This is the best that I can do. And then he wrote in his memoir that he thought that Rice agreed with him. We know that Gates agreed with him because Gates in his second memoir slammed W. Bush. He was the defense secretary, slammed W. Bush for this, called it vast overreach, and I forget, but ridiculed Bush for it. I forget his exact words. We don't know exactly what Rice and Burns told Bush, but we know that they agreed with Burns that this is absolutely insane to do this. And then it led to a war in Georgia 4 months later, because to join NATO, you have to have settled borders. And that's why Israel's not a member. And so they had two breakaway provinces, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And the Georgian government, which had been installed in a coup in 2003 in a color-coded revolution, the Rose Revolution, decided to launch that war in order to settle his border dispute so he could join the alliance. And then the Russians, of course, solved that problem by invading themselves and taking over South Ossetia for themselves, guaranteeing its so-called independence, they call it. And I mentioned the color-coded revolutions. There was a bunch of them, including the Orange Revolution in 2004 and in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, the failed Denim Revolution in Belarus in 2005 as well, and numerous others, all of these at the Russians' expense, of course. And then missile defense. W. Bush tore up the Missile Defense Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty, which says we can only have 2 anti-ballistic missile sites. In other words, enough to supposedly try to protect from an attack from North Korea or something, but not enough to protect from a Russian attack, because Nixon decided it's just brinksmanship. The more defensive missiles we build, the more offensive missiles they build, and vice versa. So we should just call it here. We already had 70,000 nukes, 30 in our hands, 40 in theirs at that time. And so it was just, this is crazy. We have to call a halt to this, was the purpose of that treaty. And W. Bush tore it up. And when he did so, he also had the effect of finally killing START 2, which would have banned all multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles from nuclear weapons on our side and theirs. One bomb per rocket, instead of what we have now is up to 24 MIRVs from a single rocket in the Russians' new heavy Satan II rocket. They call it the Sarmat 2. So when W. Bush tore up that treaty, he also killed START 2. And we know now in the future that he kicked off a brand new era of Russian development of nuclear weapons. And now they have these new heavy, as they call them, the Sarmat 2 rockets. They claim they have nuclear powered cruise missiles that have essentially unlimited range. They have new nuclear torpedoes for taking out our naval bases and coastal cities. And of course, there's hypersonics, which they've demonstrated, not with nuclear warheads, but still they've demonstrated the capability of their hypersonic missiles in Ukraine, and demonstrating that we have nothing that can shoot those down at those kind of ranges. And so, they can try to shoot down an incoming ballistic missile from space, but they have a lot more cracks at it from that altitude, even at higher speed. But these, low altitude hypersonic warheads, there's nothing that they can do about those. And so there's a new arms race, and we're losing it. Right? W. Bush kicked it all off for no reason whatsoever other than welfare for connected corporations to do this, and kicked off a whole new arms race, and we're behind in the thing. So that was a huge part of it. And then, of course, famously and hugely importantly, Barack Obama did a lot of horrible things, but the worst thing he did was support the overthrow of the government of Ukraine in January and February of 2014, and the so-called Revolution of Dignity, where it's not that the Americans were in charge of the absolute final overthrow. That was really just the Nazis that did that. But it was the Americans who had backed the Nazis in their protest movement for months leading up to that, and were demanding that the sitting president agree to their terms, including pull all of his police back from where the protesters were camped out in the town square there, and then which allowed them to then seize the rest of the government buildings and run the president out of power. So it was a joint effort between the USA and the Ukrainian Nazis to, quote, overthrow, end quote, the regime there, as even Carl Gershman, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, put it, spent high tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars to support that Maidan movement for that whole time leading up to the thing. And of course, when I call these guys Nazis, I'm not playing about it, and I'm not being flippant. And I know I'm not sure about you guys, but in America, popularly lately, it's been very fashionable for people on the left to call everyone who's not them a Nazi, but that's stupid and wrong. I am talking about actual Nazis who are the proud descendants of those who served Hitler and helped perpetrate the Holocaust in World War II. They're not even neo-Nazis. They're Nazis, man. They are actual ass Nazis. We've all heard of the people. There were people in Eastern Europe who welcomed the Nazis as liberators from the communists. And then usually the fable goes, and then they came to regret that pretty quick. And then, of course, the communists won anyway. And so anybody who had sided with the Nazis during those times then were horribly persecuted once Stalin won the war in the East and all that. So that's these guys. That's who we're talking about, is their grandfathers, right? These are the guys who did the revolution and fully with American support here. And so when I say that they're Nazis, I mean, they are self-proclaimed national socialist, racialist collectivists, right? They are, you read their spiel, it's all about, opposing the Semite-led Untermenschen and all of these kinds of things. Conservative Republicans don't talk like that. National socialists do. And that's who these guys are. And in fact, there's a article in yesterday's Sunday Times, a big profile of Andriy Beletsky, who is the leader of what's now the Third Army Corps fighting in the war, who is one of the most fanatical and lunatic of these Nazis of all. He's the one that you always see the quote of the fighting the Semitic-led Untermenschen. But if you read that whole speech, it's completely bananas about how all of that Ukrainians, and just like every nationality, is a different species of human. And we exist as one organism, and every sperm and every egg belongs to the state for the glory of the greater Ukrainian Aryan values of the insanity, right? It is the absolute babbling madness of a Nazi, right? And again, not what just everyone to the right of center talks like. This is what actual fanatical Hitlerians are like. And that's who they are. And this guy, I think, is almost certain to be the future dictator of rump Ukraine and what's left of Ukraine after this, if he doesn't die in the war, because they've made a real war hero out of him now. Again, you read it in the Sunday Times today. Oh, Putin fears this man and all this. Yeah, Hitler's ghost loves him. Okay, as long as we're on the same page here. And I demonstrate this because I know that this is disputed as Russian propaganda. I beat this dead horse just like I do with the NATO expansion in the book. These are the two issues that I document far beyond what is necessary, so that I know that no one can ever come at me and accuse me of embellishing these things or getting these points of information from the Russians or whatever. I cite the foremost Holocaust scholars like Philip Friedman and all of the rest of these guys, John Paul Himka and the rest, about what happened there in the Second World War and then in the aftermath and the rest. So you can see it for yourself. You guys are probably familiar with Omar Bartov, who is the Israeli Holocaust historian who's been denouncing the genocide in Gaza right now. I cite him thoroughly in the book. I had heard of him before because I'd been using him on my Ukraine book because he had written so much about that. So I already knew who that guy was from that. So that's the kind of sources that I rely on on the story there. And then I'm sorry, I'm going on too long about all this, but I'm already 10 minutes over on this half. But I'll skip to Russiagate was a hoax. Donald Trump could have ended this war. I should say Barack Obama and John Brennan started this war. John Brennan went to Kiev in the aftermath of the revolution. He went there on the 12th and the 13th of April. On the 14th, the acting president Turchynov launched the civil war against the people of the East. People say the Russians invaded and all this is a complete hoax. That happened much later when they sent forces in August and then the next February to help the locals fight. But it was really the government, the military itself split and went to war with itself when half of them or more defected to the other side at the start of the thing. And then they had what was called the Minsk II deal in February of 15 that brought the level of fighting down and made it less worse. So you had like 9,000 people killed the first year, and then you had another 4,000 people killed in the next 6 years after that, if that's an indication. Still, artillery war back and forth and that kind of thing. And then Trump was clearly willing, but unable to implement the deal and end the war because they falsely accused him of being a Russian agent. And he was framed by the CIA first. Check the timeline. CIA started this. John Brennan, the same guy who led al-Qaeda in Syria, the same guy who started the civil war in April of 14, was the same guy who invented Russiagate, apparently, as far as we know so far, before Hillary Clinton and her team ever got involved. It was the CIA who was pushing this thing first. And Hillary and them got on board like a month later, and they framed Trump. 100% of it was a lie. If you believe any of it, I'm sorry, you're just a sucker, man. None of it was true. None of it. Oh, no, some of it was true. No, not some of it was true. All of it was a giant lie. It was a conspiracy to pretend that there was a conspiracy to install Trump in power. When what happened was people just hate Hillary Clinton a lot. Is that a surprise? Come on. Even Bill Clinton calls her the warden. I mean, we're supposed to love and respect her and want her to be our great leader. Everybody knew, especially right wingers, have a pathological hatred for this woman. And then, but liberal Democrats don't like her either. And leftists hate her too, because leftists think that she's a right wing, imperialist, which she is in her way. And so there was just whatever. That's what happened. But that made Trump essentially unable in his first term to do anything but make things worse. His ambassador, William Taylor, did help prevent Ukraine from implementing the Minsk peace deal when the Germans had an idea of how they could do it better in 2019. So he served, they said about Trump, this is in the New York Times. They said Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. So I'm not saying he's a virtuous man and you're supposed to love him or whatever, but it's clear that he wanted to get along with Russia. And why? Because Kissinger told him it was smart to divide Russia from China, the same way we divided China from Russia back during the old Cold War. And now it was Kissinger who did that. Now Kissinger's saying, now we want to split Russia away from China the best we can. And Trump was like, yeah, that's what I think too. So it wasn't like, oh, he's Ron Paul and just, is a non-interventionist or whatever. It's just that he had a different strategy for how to deal with the Chinese, basically is what it came down to. And so he sincerely wanted to get along with Russia, and he was just unable to. And then Joe Biden comes in, he spends the first year being just completely belligerent, making repeated threats, encouraging the Ukrainian government to crack down on all the centers, outlaw opposition media and political parties, and then makes repeated promises to bring Ukraine into NATO from the State Department and the Defense Department, and advancing what they call interoperability, which means making Ukraine's military de facto member of NATO, where they don't have the war guarantee, but everyone understands that if we went to war with the Russian Federation, their military would be just another auxiliary military with the rest of Eastern Europe there, and in fighting against Russia. And so they were essentially pushing the Russians back up against the wall. And at one point, Putin even said, I think they're setting me up here. It's obvious what they're doing, right? They're trying to get me to react and start a war. But then he explains how they're doing that and that he still might have no choice but to fall for it anyway. If they are really going to be insistent on bringing Ukraine into NATO and even deploying, even if they call them defensive missiles, they're from dual use launchers that can hold Tomahawk cruise missiles, that and they think they're going to do this, they're going to give me no choice but to go ahead and invade. And then that's exactly what happened. And if you go back and look at the end of 21 and beginning of 22, I believe that plan A was to warn the Russians, you better not, and really try to convince them not to do it. I think that they just said that so many times that you have to take it at face value, right? However, plan B was not, let's negotiate a way out of this. Joe Biden did not say to William Burns, I trust you, William, to see me through this. No, that was not what happened. Plan B was, we're going to give them their own Vietnam again, just like we did to the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s, just like we just finished doing to ourselves in Afghanistan in the 2000s and teens. We're going to now replicate that again against the Russians in Ukraine. We're going to inflict on them a strategic defeat. And so they did, I believe. Again, plan A was to dissuade them, but plan B clearly was to lure them in. We're not going to do what it takes to prevent this war. We're just as happy to see them invade, in fact. And I have quote after quote after quote from these people. They're so shameless, the way that they sometimes don't even mention the Ukrainians at all. When they say we are killing Russians, but no Americans are dying. This is the best bang for our buck that we could ever get. Boy, this is war on the cheap. And they just occasionally, like Mitt Romney will go, oh, the Ukrainians have fought bravely, right? They'll like throw them a crumb. But much of the time, they won't even mention the Ukrainians, right? So they'll say the Russian soldiers' lives have value to degrade, and American soldiers' lives have value to preserve. And the Ukrainians' lives don't even have value worth mentioning at all. They are simply cannon fodder in this thing. They are there to get killed because each time an artillery shell explodes one of them to death, It costs the Russians $1.75. And that's a strategic defeat on Russia. And the cost to Ukraine doesn't matter at all. It's really ugly and cynical. I can't think of an example in foreign policy where they really were that avowedly willing to sacrifice the lives of their pretended friends and allies in such a blatant way to achieve whatever end, right? I mean, not that they wouldn't, but that they would talk that way. Like, what do we care how many Hazaras die as long as we inflict a punishment on the Pashtuns, right? They didn't say that. Who cares how many Hazaras die? Of course, they would always pretend that we're fighting for the Hazaras. We're trying to protect the Hazaras. We love the little old Hazaras. Here, they're like, oh, the Ukrainians, yeah, whatever. Anyway, they got to die freezing and bleeding out in the mud and everything. But you know what? We're costing the Russians money. It's great. And you hear them over and over again, Russian coffins, Russian body bags, over and over again. And then what's even their argument there? They're like, someday this will amount to an economic and a moral defeat for Putin, that this will cost him the public support of the Russian people. Sometimes they'll even say this is clearly going to destabilize his government and cause Putin to fall. That was what Madeleine Albright fantasized right before she died, that this war in Ukraine is going to lead to the end of the Putin regime. And so, of course, it's worth it to sacrifice even every last Ukrainian if we have to. If we're certain that we're going to get the end of the Putin regime out of it, they rationalize, which of course is not true. They haven't inflicted a strategic defeat on the Russians at all. They simply kicked the Russians out of Europe and pushed them toward Asia. So now they've expanded their trade and military relationships with Asian countries. Now they're building up the North Koreans. Now they're doing they're selling more raw resources to China than before. We were supposed to be dividing them away from the Chinese. Now we've forced them right into China's arms. And all of these things is just completely backwards. Nothing happened the way that they promised. And they've gotten, I don't think anybody really knows, but obviously like high hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians killed and many more than that wounded. And they've left, a rump Ukraine that is going to be a total basket case and a dependent on the West for the indefinite future, and probably run by insane right-wing lunatics who are going to continue to pick a fight with the Russians on their border that they absolutely pathologically hate, and vice versa. And so it's a complete wreck. And the Russians said, look, they proposed 2 treaties in December. And I talked to, diplomatic experts myself on the show, like Chas Freeman and others. But I also read it in the New York Times and the Washington Post that it's in the book, I cite the sources, that even the Biden administration officials were telling the papers that these treaties are a reasonable basis for negotiation, right? It's not that we should just sign on the dotted line, but are these comparable to Madeleine Albright's Rambouillet Accord in 1999, which was an offer that was made to be rejected? It was full of absolutely unacceptable poison pills that was essentially just for show as an excuse for a war. No, this was not the Rambouillet Accords. Everything in those treaties was at least negotiable and reasonable. And they were mostly asking us just to live up to promises that our previous presidents had made, was all. But they would not negotiate those treaties. They absolutely would not even consider it. I said, there's this open door to NATO. And what that means is any country can join NATO if they want to, and we want them to. And no third country's interests can ever be taken into account. Screw them. And the way that they phrased it was like, does anyone here at the table think that Russia ought to have a total veto power over who's allowed to join our alliance? Nobody raises their hand. So they go, okay, that's it then. So the answer is, no matter if the Russians are swearing to God that they will go to war over it, still, nobody has, every sovereign nation has a sovereign inalienable right to direct their gaze in whichever way that they want and join any military alliance they want. Now, they made it clear they were not going to bring Ukraine into NATO, but they would fight to the last Ukrainian to prove the principle that they can if they want to, even if they don't want to, and that they don't have to listen to the Russians when the Russians shout stop. And so that was the pretext, essentially, upon which they refused to negotiate and started the war. And so, well, not started it, but
Scott, thank you.
greatly encouraged Vladimir Putin to escalate his side of it by 100,000%. And that's where we are now.